They say ignorance is bliss. Looking back, I understand the appeal of that saying now more than ever. I never thought my marriage of 12 years would turn into a story of betrayal, lies, and heartbreak, but here we are. This is how it all began. My wife, Emily, and I were a pretty typical couple, or so I thought. We met when we were in our mid-20s, both ambitious and excited about life. She was kind, warm, and funny, and we just clicked. Within a couple of years, we were married, and we built a life together that, from the outside, seemed like the perfect picture of happiness. We had a cozy home, 2 beautiful children, and a network of friends and family that surrounded us. One of those friends, in fact, was Tom, who had been like a brother to me. Tom and I went way back, to high school. We were inseparable, even after we both got married and had families of our own. Our kids would play together, and our families often spent holidays and weekends together. He was the kind of friend I never had to question, and I trusted him completely, or at least, I did. It all started with a vague feeling, a sort of nagging suspicion. At first, I thought it was just stress. Work had been hectic, and I knew Emily had been feeling distant, but we chalked it up to the usual strains of life. I never wanted to be the paranoid husband, so I brushed my suspicions aside. I loved Emily, she was the mother of my children and my partner in life. I couldn't imagine a reason why she would betray that trust. But then, small things started to add up. It was subtle at first. She'd be on her phone late at night, texting with friends or catching up with family. When I asked her about it, she'd always brush it off, saying it was nothing. Just catching up with friends, she'd say, and I wanted to believe her. Then there were the late nights out, where she'd say she was going to a work function or grabbing drinks with friends. I didn't want to come off as controlling, so I'd nod and say goodbye, ignoring the pit in my stomach that seemed to grow each time. Then came the day I found an odd message on her phone. I wasn't trying to snoop, I'd just borrowed her phone to make a quick call. But there it was, clear as day, a message from Tom. It wasn't a message that screamed infidelity, but something about it felt off. He called her M, a nickname that only I used. And the tone was too familiar, too casual, as if they were sharing secrets I wasn't meant to know. My heart raced as questions buzzed through my mind. Why was he messaging her in the first place? They weren't especially close, at least as far as I knew. I wanted to believe that I was overthinking, that this was nothing. But doubt has a way of growing, of gnawing away at your mind until it's impossible to ignore. I began to wonder if I was living in a reality where my wife had hidden parts of herself from me, where she'd formed bonds I hadn't known about. As the days passed, I began to notice more details that didn't quite add up. Emily would mention small lies, like where she had been or who she was with, and when I casually brought it up later, her story would change, just slightly, but enough to spark my suspicions again. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces were deliberately hidden from view. The final straw came one night when Emily was supposed to be out for work drinks. Our children were in bed, and I was home alone, scrolling through social media to pass the time. As I mindlessly scrolled, a photo appeared that nearly stopped my heart. Emily was in the background of a friend's post, sitting next to Tom. She wasn't at work drinks, she was with him, laughing and looking far too comfortable. That night, when she came home, I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I asked her directly, point blank, if there was anything going on between her and Tom. She looked startled, then angry. "How could you even think that?" she hissed, crossing her arms defensively. She was so convincing, so adamant that I almost let it go right then and there. But something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt or fear, told me that there was more to this story. In bed that night, I lay awake, haunted by that flicker. I knew I needed answers, and I wasn't sure I could wait any longer to find them. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, The First Clues. Sleep eluded me that night. I kept replaying Emily's reaction in my head, how quickly she'd gone from shock to anger, deflecting my question as though the mere suggestion was absurd. But that flicker in her eyes, that moment of hesitation, wouldn't let me shake off the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The next morning, I resolved to find out the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. As I got ready for work, I noticed her phone on the kitchen counter. She was upstairs getting the kids ready, and for a moment, I hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt for even considering it. But the doubts kept gnawing at me, so I gave in. With shaky hands, I opened her messages. My stomach twisted as I read through a series of innocuous texts between her and Tom. Most were friendly, nothing too intimate, but there were small signs that seemed off, inside jokes I didn't understand, cryptic messages that seemed innocent on the surface but felt loaded with subtext. Then I saw one that made my heart pound. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. The message was from 2 weeks ago. She'd told me she was at a late meeting that night. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, my hands trembling as I put her phone back in the exact position I'd found it. A cold realization swept over me. I had proof now, but it only left me with more questions. How long had this been going on? How could she hide this from me for so long? And, most painfully, why Tom? My best friend, the person I trusted like a brother. Over the next few days, I kept up appearances as best I could. Emily acted as though everything was normal, and I pretended to believe it. It was agonizing, watching her laugh with the kids, planning our weekend as though nothing had changed. I felt like a stranger in my own home, a ghost haunting the edges of the life we'd built together. One night, unable to stand the tension, I confronted her again. Emily, are you sure there's nothing going on between you and Tom? I asked, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. She shot me a sharp look, frustration flickering in her eyes. Why are you bringing this up again? She snapped, her tone icy. I told you, there's nothing. I don't know why you're being so paranoid. I took a deep breath, swallowing the lump in my throat. Because I saw your messages, Emily. I saw what you wrote to him about last night being amazing. Her face went pale, and for a brief moment, I saw panic flash across her features. She quickly composed herself, though, and crossed her arms, her voice low and defensive. That was a joke. You're blowing this out of proportion. Tom and I are just friends. I felt a sickening mix of anger and heartbreak. She wasn't even trying to deny it outright, she was twisting the truth, weaving lies to protect herself. I knew I was being manipulated, but part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that this was all some misunderstanding. After all, we had 12 years of memories together. Could it all have been a lie? But I needed more than hollow reassurances. I had to know the full story, and I wasn't going to get it from her. So I decided to dig deeper. Chapter 3, The Search for Truth. The following day, I called in sick to work and took matters into my own hands. I started by checking her social media accounts, scrolling through posts and messages, looking for anything that might give me a clue. There were photos of us together, of the kids, of family vacations, and then, a few that included Tom. It was subtle, but I noticed a pattern. Tom was always there on the days when she'd been out with friends or at work functions. I started reaching out to mutual friends, asking casual questions about the times Emily had been out with them. Most of them didn't think twice about answering, confirming that Emily had often seemed preoccupied or left early on those nights. One friend even mentioned, offhandedly, that she'd seen Emily and Tom together at a bar a few weeks back. My stomach churned as the pieces started falling into place. By this point, I was beginning to accept the painful truth. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet, not until I had irrefutable proof. I went as far as hiring a private investigator, a move I never thought I'd make in a million years. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but I was desperate. I needed concrete evidence, something she couldn't deny or explain away. Within a few days, the investigator confirmed my worst fears. Emily and Tom had been meeting regularly, and it wasn't just casual. They were seen having dinner together, holding hands, even sharing a kiss. The evidence was undeniable. When the investigator handed me the photos, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. There was no room left for denial, no hope that this was some terrible misunderstanding. My wife, my best friend, the mother of my children, she had been lying to me, living a double life right under my nose. That night, I confronted Emily one last time. I showed her the photos, watching as her face crumbled, the mask finally slipping. She tried to speak, to come up with an excuse or an explanation, but there was nothing she could say that would erase what she'd done. "Why, Emily?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my chest hollow with betrayal. "Why did you do this to us? To our family?" She looked down, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt empty, hollow. It was in that moment that I knew, there was no going back. The life we'd built together, the memories, the trust, it was all shattered. And as much as it tore me apart, I knew I had to let go. This was the end of our story. Dash. Asterisk end of chapter 2 and chapter 3 asterisk chapter 4, the fallout. The days that followed were a blur of emotion. Emily and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was to discuss logistics, who would stay with the kids, who would move out, and how we'd break the news to our families. The hurt, the anger, and the confusion seemed to hang over our house like a thick fog, suffocating us both. The kids, of course, didn't understand. They were too young to grasp what had happened, but they could feel the tension. They sensed the change in the air, the way the walls seemed to close in around us. And that broke me more than anything else. I wasn't just losing my wife, I was losing my family. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, Emily sat down beside me. She looked exhausted, as though the weight of the last few days had drained the life from her. For a moment, we just sat there, in silence, two strangers who had once shared everything. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how it got this far," she said, her eyes not meeting mine. "I never meant for it to happen. But somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling. I stopped feeling like me. And then I met Tom, and I don't know. It was easy, too easy. He listened to me, understood me in ways that I didn't know I needed. I was so lonely, and I got caught up in it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her how she could betray me, how she could let it go on for so long without a second thought. But instead, I just nodded, the hurt threatening to overwhelm me. "And what now?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of the question. "Do you think you'll be happy with him?" She didn't answer right away. Her gaze flickered toward the floor, and I could see the shame in her eyes. "I don't know," she said, barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I'm not sure I can go back. What we had, it's broken now. And I don't know how to fix it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't even trying to save our marriage anymore. She had already checked out, emotionally if not physically. And that realization was like a dagger to my heart. Dash. Chapter 5, Moving Forward. A few weeks passed, and things became even more strained between Emily and me. The conversation about the kids was the only thing that kept us tethered to any semblance of civility. The tension between us was palpable, and every time I looked at her, I felt a mixture of betrayal and heartbreak. But there was also something else, something I couldn't ignore: anger. I was angry at her. Angry at Tom. Angry at myself for not seeing the signs sooner, for ignoring the little cracks in our relationship until it was too late. But more than anything, I was angry that my life had been upended in such a cruel and sudden way. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything we had built together, the years we had spent as a family, the promises we had made to each other. It felt like everything had been reduced to rubble, and I was left to pick up the pieces. I moved out into a small apartment not far from the house, where the kids stayed with Emily during the week and came to visit me on weekends. The first night in my new place was the hardest. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. It didn't feel real. Emily and I continued to talk, albeit in brief, tense conversations. There was a strange awkwardness between us, like we were two people who had once known each other completely but now were strangers. There were times when I still saw glimpses of the woman I had loved, but it was buried under the weight of her betrayal. Eventually, I began to see a therapist, something I never thought I'd need. It helped, at least a little. Talking to someone who didn't know me, who didn't judge me, was strangely comforting. But even so, there were days when the pain was unbearable. Some days, it felt like I would never be able to move on, that the betrayal would always hang over me, suffocating me. Chapter 6, The Confrontation. About a month after I moved out, I received a call from Tom. His voice was shaky when he spoke, and for a moment, I wondered if he was calling to apologize, to explain himself. But I wasn't sure if I could even face him. The man I had trusted as a brother had betrayed me in the worst possible way. "I'm sorry, man," Tom said. "I don't know how to say this, but I never meant for this to happen. I don't want to hurt you, but I need to be honest with you. Emily and we've been together. It's not just physical. I think I'm in love with her." I didn't know how to react. I should have felt rage, maybe even vindication, but instead, I just felt empty. The world I knew had crumbled, and all I could do was sit there, listening to him stutter through his apology. "You've ruined everything," I said quietly. "You were my best friend, Tom. And now I don't even know who you are." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I know, and I'll never forgive myself for what I did. I never wanted to hurt you, but I didn't know what else to do. I love her, man. I'm sorry." His words echoed in my ears long after we hung up. There was no reconciliation to be had. There was no magic moment where we could go back to being friends. There was only the aftermath of their betrayal and the painful reality that everything I thought I knew was now shattered. Chapter 7, Healing. Time passed, and slowly, the sting of the betrayal began to dull. I focused on my kids, on finding a new routine, on trying to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy. There were days when I thought I might never trust anyone again, when I was overwhelmed by the weight of everything I'd lost. But over time, I found strength I didn't know I had. Emily and I began to find a new kind of balance, co-parenting in a way that was functional, if not entirely civil. The anger eventually faded, though the scars remained. I don't know if we'll ever be able to look at each other without the shadow of the affair hanging over us. But I know I'm learning to live with it. As for Tom, we haven't spoken since that phone call. I don't know if I ever will again. In the end, the betrayal came from both sides, the woman I loved and the friend I trusted. And though I don't have all the answers, I'm learning that I don't need them. The healing will take time, but I know I'll be okay. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8, The New Normal. Months passed, and while the raw pain of the affair began to dull, the scars remained. Emily and I settled into a kind of uneasy routine. The kids were doing well, but they noticed the change in our dynamic. They didn't ask questions, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes when they looked at us. They missed the way things used to be, and I missed it too more than I cared to admit. As for me, I was slowly adjusting to my new life. My small apartment had become a place of solitude, somewhere I could process the wreckage of my past. It was strange at first, living alone after years of marriage. The silence felt deafening, but over time, I started to find peace in it. It gave me the space to rebuild, to reevaluate who I was without Emily, without the life I had thought would last forever. I began to reconnect with old friends, people I'd drifted away from over the years, people who didn't know Emily, who didn't know what had happened. They were a reminder of a time before all of this. It was refreshing to talk to people who didn't see me as a victim, but just as myself. Slowly, I started to remember who I was before marriage, before the betrayal. I was learning to live for myself again. Chapter 9, The Unexpected Turn. It was about 6 months after the affair was revealed when Emily reached out to me with a request that I hadn't expected. We had been communicating mostly about the kids, handling things with the logistics of custody and scheduling. But one afternoon, she sent me a text that stopped me in my tracks. "I need to talk. It's important." I stared at the message for a while, unsure what to make of it. We hadn't talked about much beyond our children and the occasional mundane update. I hadn't even considered that Emily might want to discuss anything deeper. Yet, there it was, a clear invitation to reopen a conversation I had long since closed off in my heart. When I arrived at the house that evening to pick up the kids, I found her sitting in the living room, looking more worn than I had ever seen her. There were bags under her eyes, and she seemed to be carrying a weight far heavier than just the consequences of her actions. "Hey," she said softly when I walked in. "Thanks for coming. I've been thinking a lot about everything." I nodded, unsure what to expect. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what she had to say, but curiosity got the better of me. "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She hesitated, and then let out a long sigh. "About me. About us. About the last year. I know I hurt you in ways that I can't undo. But I need you to know, I've been working on myself. I've been seeing a therapist, and I've realized so much about myself, about what led me to make the choices I did." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or genuine self-awareness in her voice, but it was clear that she had spent a lot of time reflecting. It almost felt like a plea for forgiveness, though she didn't say it outright. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Emily continued, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I just need you to know that I am truly sorry. I betrayed you, and I hate myself for it. I thought I could handle everything on my own, but I was so lost, and I took you for granted. And I hurt you in ways that I will never be able to make right." I stayed quiet, letting her words sink in. For so long, I had been consumed by my own hurt and anger that I hadn't considered what she might have gone through, what led her to make such destructive choices. Still, a part of me felt like I couldn't let her off the hook that easily. The damage was done, and no amount of apologizing could change what had happened. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied slowly, "but I don't think I'm ready to forgive you. I'm still processing everything, and I'm not sure if I ever will." She nodded, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I understand. I don't expect you to. I just needed you to know that I see what I've done, and I'm trying to make things right for myself and for the kids." There was silence between us for a moment as the weight of our shared history hung in the air. I thought back to the person she had been before all of this, the woman I had loved, the person I thought I knew so well. That woman was still there, buried beneath the hurt and the betrayal. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't entirely impossible. Chapter 10, The Path to Healing. The months that followed were a slow, painful process of rebuilding not just my relationship with Emily, but my own sense of self. We continued to co-parent, navigating our new dynamic as ex-spouses who were still tied together by the children we shared. There were awkward moments, silent dinners, and long stretches of uncomfortable conversations, but there were also glimmers of something new, something that resembled mutual respect. We had begun seeing a counselor together to work through our issues as co-parents. It wasn't about fixing our marriage, at least, not for me, but about learning to navigate the mess we had created with as much grace as possible for the sake of our children. Emily had her own therapy sessions, and I continued with mine. Slowly, she started to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, and I began to see that she was truly trying to be a better version of herself. Still, there were days when the anger and pain flared up. Sometimes, I would catch myself wondering if I had made the right decision in staying involved with her at all. But there were also moments when I realized that forgiveness wasn't just about her, it was about me, too. It was about freeing myself from the burden of carrying this pain, of letting go of the past to make room for something healthier, even if it was just for the sake of moving forward. Emily and I would never be the same. The trust was gone, the foundation of our relationship was cracked beyond repair, and we both knew that our marriage was over. But we were learning how to share a new, different kind of relationship, one built on shared responsibilities as parents, and hopefully, one day, a kind of friendship. As for Tom, I hadn't heard from him since that phone call. I didn't think I ever would. That friendship was lost forever. But I had learned something important through all of this: the people who truly matter are those who stand by you when everything falls apart, not those who break you when you least expect it. For now, my focus was on the future, on my kids, on finding my own happiness again, and on healing, piece by piece. It wouldn't be easy, and I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that I was moving forward. And that was enough for me. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11, A New Beginning. As time passed, I began to accept that life would never return to what it once was. The trust between Emily and me was irreparably broken, and the life we had built together, as a family, was something I had to mourn. But I also realized that, while the past couldn't be undone, the future was still within my control. The new year brought with it a shift in my mindset. I wasn't just living in the aftermath anymore, I was starting to make choices with the intent to heal. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of agency. I had spent so much time reeling from the betrayal, feeling like a victim, but now, I was beginning to take steps toward reclaiming my life. The first step was focusing on myself. I joined a gym to work off some of the frustration and anxiety that had built up inside me over the last year. Exercise became a form of therapy, a way for me to channel the overwhelming emotions that had no other outlet. It wasn't just about physical strength, it was about rebuilding my sense of self-worth. I also started to rediscover passions I had neglected for years. Hobbies I once loved, writing, photography, cooking, became my refuge. The small joys in life began to remind me that there was still beauty, still purpose in my days. I didn't need Emily to validate who I was anymore. I was learning, slowly, how to validate myself. Chapter 12, A Change of Heart. It had been almost a year since the truth about Emily and Tom came to light, and while I wasn't the same person I had been before, I had found a sense of peace I didn't think was possible. Emily and I had settled into a comfortable routine as co-parents. The awkwardness was still there, but it had dulled over time. We had learned to work together for the sake of the kids, and even though our relationship had become one of quiet distance, there was a mutual respect that had grown between us. One evening, after the kids were in bed, Emily asked if we could talk. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected another conversation like the one we had months ago, but her tone was calm, almost resigned. "I've been thinking," she began, looking out the window as she spoke. "About everything. About you, about us, and what went wrong. I know it doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I've been working on myself, trying to understand why I made the choices I did. And I know I can't undo the past, but I need you to know that I will always care about you. You were my best friend for a long time. I wasn't sure how to respond. Her words struck a chord, but they didn't change what had happened. I had long ago come to terms with the fact that our marriage was over, but hearing her express regret, hearing her acknowledge the pain she had caused, it hit harder than I expected. I'm sorry too, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. I've carried a lot of anger, but I'm trying to let it go. I don't think we'll ever be able to go back to what we were, but I hope one day we can find a way to move forward, in some way. For the kids. And for ourselves. Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I hope so too. I really do. We sat in silence for a long time after that, not speaking, but feeling a sense of understanding between us. It wasn't the reconciliation I had once dreamed of, but it was something. And in that moment, I realized that healing didn't always come in the form I expected. Sometimes, it came in the smallest of steps, in letting go of the past and accepting the present. Chapter 13, New Horizons. Months turned into a year, and the changes in me continued. I had learned to forgive not for Emily's sake, but for my own. Letting go of the anger and betrayal didn't mean forgetting what had happened, but it did mean that I was no longer letting it define me. I started dating again, something I hadn't considered in the first months after the divorce. It wasn't easy, and I wasn't sure I was ready for anything serious. But meeting new people, having conversations with women who didn't know the man I used to be, it felt refreshing, like a breath of fresh air. I wasn't trying to replace Emily, and I wasn't looking for someone to fix me. I was simply opening myself up to the possibility of connection again. I also began thinking about my future in ways I hadn't before. The life I had envisioned for myself, one with Emily, with a family, with stability, was gone. But in its place, a new life was emerging. I started considering new career opportunities, thinking about places I wanted to travel, goals I wanted to accomplish. There was so much more I wanted to experience. Emily, too, had started a new chapter. I heard from mutual friends that she was dating someone, though she never brought it up directly. It wasn't my place to ask, and frankly, I didn't need to know. She had her own path to follow, and I had mine. We continued our co-parenting arrangement, though there were still moments of tension: birthday parties, school events, the occasional disagreement over how to raise the kids. But, overall, we had settled into a more peaceful, respectful place. I had found my way, and though the road had been long and painful, I was stronger for it. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago, and maybe that was the best thing that had come out of all of this, the realization that I was capable of rebuilding my life, that I could emerge from the ashes of my past and still find hope. Chapter 14, Moving On. One day, as I sat on the porch of my apartment, sipping my coffee and watching the sun rise, I thought back to everything that had happened: the betrayal, the heartbreak, the years of pain and healing. I had lost a lot, but I had gained so much more in the process. I had found resilience, discovered strength I didn't know I had, and learned the importance of self-love and forgiveness. I wasn't sure what the future held, none of us ever really are. But I knew one thing for sure: I had the power to shape it. The chapter with Emily and I was over, but the story of my life was still being written. And this time, I was writing it for me.